For most of the last decade, Xbox Game Pass has been presented as the future of gaming. Microsoft would release its biggest game directly into Game Pass. Players would subscribe instead of buying individual titles. Developers would gain access to a massive audience. Xbox would generate predictable monthly revenue, and eventually the service would reach hundreds of millions of people across consoles, PCs, phones, televisions, and the cloud. On paper, it sounded almost unstoppable. Microsoft had the money, it had the servers, it owned Windows, it was buying some of the biggest publishers in the industry, and unlike Sony or Nintendo, Microsoft didn't necessarily need to sell you a console. It just needed to convince you to enter the Xbox ecosystem somewhere. But nearly a decade after Game Pass launched, the conversation has changed. Subscriber growth has slowed, Xbox hardware sales have collapsed, Microsoft has repeatedly changed the service's pricing and structure. Some of Xbox's biggest games are now appearing on PlayStation, and Modern Warfare 4 will not launch directly into Game Pass, despite Call of Duty once being presented as the ultimate weapon for growing the service. So, is Xbox Game Pass actually a failed business strategy? My honest answer is complicated, because Game Pass is not a failed product, but it may have failed at the much bigger job Microsoft expected it to do. Game Pass generates a serious amount of revenue. Microsoft revealed that Game Pass produced nearly $5 billion in annual revenue during its 2025 financial year. That is not pocket change. Even for Microsoft, it is more revenue than many successful publishers generate from their entire businesses. Microsoft has also previously described Game Pass as profitable, although the company has never given the public a complete breakdown of how it calculates that profitability. Microsoft can say the service is profitable after accounting for subscription, income, and the amount Game Pass internally pays for content. But that does not necessarily tell us whether putting a game into Game Pass was more profitable than selling millions of copies at full price. Those are two different questions. Still, $5 billion in revenue means we cannot reasonably describe Game Pass as some complete commercial disaster that nobody uses. In February 2024, Microsoft said Game Pass had 34 million members. The service has introduced millions of players to games they might never have purchased, and Microsoft has claimed that Game Pass members play more genres and generally engage more heavily after subscribing. For smaller developers, that exposure can be incredibly valuable. A guaranteed Game Pass payment can reduce the financial risk of releasing a game while giving it immediate access to a large audience. As a consumer service, Game Pass has also been fantastic at times. You can play games like Forza Horizon, Halo Infinite, Starfield, Indiana Jones, Doom, and Call of Duty through one subscription. For someone who plays several games every year, the value was almost ridiculous. And that might have been part of the problem. The early version of Game Pass trained Xbox players not to buy Xbox games. Microsoft spent years telling its most loyal customers that every major first-party release would arrive in the subscription on day one. That sounds amazing from the perspective of the player, but from the perspective of the business, you are replacing a potential £60 or £70 purchase with a monthly payment that also needs to fund hundreds of other games, cloud infrastructure, licensing agreements, development costs, and online services. Microsoft itself acknowledged during the Activision Blizzard regulatory process that adding games to Game Pass can reduce their traditional sales. Its internal analysis found that base game sales declined after titles entered the service, although the exact percentage was redacted. That does not automatically mean the model cannot work. Subscriptions are built around lifetime value. Microsoft might sacrifice one £70 sale because it believes that player will remain subscribed for 3 years, purchase downloadable content, spend money on microtransactions, and become more deeply connected to Xbox. But that calculation only works when subscriber numbers keep growing and people remain subscribed. When growth slows, the weaknesses become much more visible. You have already trained your audience not to buy the games, you still need to produce expensive content to stop them cancelling, and every new release becomes less of a product that generates immediate revenue and more of a cost required to maintain the subscription. That is the content treadmill that companies such as Netflix understand very well. The difference is that a television episode might cost a few $1 million. A modern blockbuster game can cost hundreds of millions, require 5 or 6 years of development, and still launch unfinished. Game development is an incredibly difficult business to force into a constant monthly content schedule. This is where the argument against Game Pass becomes much stronger. Game Pass reached 25 million subscribers in early 2022. Microsoft later reported 34 million members in February 24, although that later figure included users from the rebranded Xbox Live Gold tier, Game Pass Core. That was still growth, but not the explosive growth Microsoft appeared to be building towards. Recent reporting suggests Game Pass is now sitting at roughly 30 million subscribers, compared with an internal projection of approximately 77 million by this point. Microsoft's own June 2026 Xbox update also admitted that the service had experienced more than 8 months of decline before beginning to grow again following recent changes. Think about how important that is. Microsoft did not merely add a subscription option to an already successful Xbox business, it reorganized Xbox around Game Pass. It purchased Bethesda's parent company for $7.5 billion, it purchased Activision Blizzard for $68.7 billion, it accepted that game sales would be cannibalized, it pushed day one releases as a defining advantage of the platform. Those investments become much harder to justify when the subscriber base remains around 30 million rather than approaching 70 or 80 million. 30 million subscribers can support a successful service, but can it support Microsoft's enormous content operation? Several major publishers, dozens of studios, and a constant supply of expensive day one releases. The recent changes suggest Microsoft itself may no longer believe the original model can. Call of Duty should have been the moment Game Pass became unavoidable. This is one of the largest entertainment franchises in the world. It sells millions of copies every year, generates enormous revenue from microtransactions, and attracts an audience far beyond traditional Xbox fans. Putting Black Ops 6 and Black Ops 7 into Game Pass was meant to prove that Microsoft could sacrifice individual game sales in exchange for subscription growth and long-term engagement. But the results do not appear to have produced the transformation Xbox wanted. And now Modern Warfare 4, launching in October 26, will not be included with Game Pass at release. Players will have to purchase it separately. That decision is incredibly revealing. Microsoft spent nearly $69 billion acquiring Activision Blizzard, and yet it has decided that the newest Call of Duty is more valuable as a traditional sold product than as a tool for growing Game Pass. That does not mean Call of Duty will never return to the service. It means Microsoft is finally recognizing that not every game should be treated identically. A smaller experimental title might benefit enormously from Game Pass exposure. An older game might receive a second life. A multiplayer game might gain enough additional uses to generate revenue through expansions and cosmetic items. But a guaranteed blockbuster capable of selling 20 or 30 million copies, putting that game into a subscription on day one may simply involve sacrificing too much money. The biggest defense of Game Pass has always been that its value should not be measured in isolation. Perhaps Game Pass does not maximize software sales, but it makes people buy Xbox consoles. Perhaps it does not make enormous profits itself, but it attracts players who spend money elsewhere in the ecosystem. The problem is that Xbox hardware has continued to decline. Microsoft reported that Xbox hardware revenue fell 32% year over year during the second quarter of its 2026 financial year, followed by another 33% decline in the third quarter. Xbox content and services revenue also declined by 5% in both periods. Microsoft's overall gaming revenue fell 7% in the last reported quarter. Now, Game Pass is not solely responsible for that. The Series X and Series S are aging machines. Microsoft has made major games available on competing consoles. The entire hardware market is facing rising costs, and Xbox entered this generation behind PlayStation. But that is precisely the point. Game Pass was supposed to help Xbox overcome those disadvantages. Instead, Xbox consoles have become less essential because Microsoft has spent years telling people that the device itself does not matter. You can play Xbox games on PC. You can stream them to a television. You can buy them on a PlayStation. You can access parts of the ecosystem through handhelds and mobile devices. That strategy potentially expands Microsoft's total audience, but it also removes the urgency to buy an Xbox console. And without a strong console base, it becomes harder to grow Game Pass on console, which Microsoft previously admitted was already reaching saturation. Xbox created a circular problem. Game Pass weakened the need to purchase Xbox hardware, but weaker Xbox hardware sales limited the audience most likely to subscribe to Game Pass. The clearest evidence that the original Game Pass model has not worked is Microsoft's own behavior. In April 2026, Microsoft reduced the price of Game Pass Ultimate from $29.99 to $22.99 per month and lowered the price of PC Game Pass from $16.49 to $13.99. Microsoft later warned investors that those price reductions would contribute to a double-digit decline in Xbox content and services revenue. Companies generally do not lower the price of a rapidly expanding subscription service unless they believe the existing price is discouraging customers. Microsoft has also created more complicated tiers, limited day one access on certain plans, and removed Modern Warfare 4 from the day one promise altogether. This does not look like Xbox abandoning Game Pass. It looks like Xbox attempting to turn Game Pass into a more conventional, sustainable subscription. Not every first-party game needs to appear immediately. Microsoft could sell major releases, traditionally for 6 or 12 months before adding them to the service. It could use Game Pass to support older titles, smaller projects, multiplayer communities, and games that benefit from discovery. That would make the service less spectacular, but potentially much healthier. The original promise of every Xbox game arriving on day one was incredible marketing. It may simply have been terrible economics. Game Pass is not a failure in the way Google Stadia was a failure. It has millions of subscribers. It generates billions of dollars. It has created genuine value for players, helped many developers find audiences, and pushed the entire industry to take subscription gaming seriously. As a product, Game Pass has succeeded. But as the central strategy for rebuilding Xbox, the answer is much less positive. It has not produced the subscriber growth Microsoft expected. It hasn't saved Xbox hardware or removed the need to sell games traditionally. It has potentially encouraged Xbox's most dedicated customers to stop purchasing first-party releases. And after spending tens of billions of dollars acquiring content for the service, Microsoft is now lowering prices, changing tiers and keeping its biggest games of 2026 outside the subscription. That looks less like the future arriving and more like a company correcting an enormous strategic overreach. The mistake was not creating Game Pass. The mistake was believing Game Pass could become the answer to everything. It was expected to sell consoles, expand PC gaming, launch cloud gaming, fund studios, grow Microsoft's audience, replace individual game sales, and transform Xbox into the Netflix of gaming. No single product could realistically carry all of that weight. Game Pass should probably remain an important part of Xbox. It just cannot be Xbox's entire identity. So is Game Pass a failed business strategy? The service itself? No. The original vision of Game Pass becoming the engine that would solve every major problem facing Xbox, at this point, I think it's becoming very difficult to call that anything other than a failure.